It began not with the roar of engines, but with a silence that made men uneasy, the kind of silence that sat heavy in the air before the storm broke. High above the smoking ruins of Berlin, Luftwaffe pilots squinted into the pale dawn light, searching the horizon for the familiar silhouettes of their own kind, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, anything German. But what they saw instead made their stomachs drop. Sleek, silver sunlight-cutting shapes, long noses, bubble canopies, wings that gleamed like knives, were slicing through the clouds. They weren't German. They weren't supposed to be there. They were American P-51 Mustangs, and they were flying over Berlin itself. For the men of the Luftwaffe, this was the nightmare they had joked about in mess halls, something that could never happen. Berlin was their fortress. It was supposed to be untouchable. Yet now, the skies above the Reich's capital belonged to someone else. The first pilot to spot them, Oberleutnant Hans Dieter, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He blinked, rubbed his goggles, cursed, and checked again. But the silver ghosts were real. "Mustangs," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of his Bf-109's engine. "Over Berlin? Impossible!" He had seen them before, over France, over the Channel, even near the Ardennes, but never here, never this deep. The Americans had reached the heart of the Reich, and the fact that they were flying this high, this confidently, meant something terrifying. Germany had lost control of its own airspace. For years, the Luftwaffe had been the master of the skies. In 1939 and 1940, their engines had roared over Poland, Norway, and France like gods of thunder. Even the British had once trembled at the sound of their approach. But that was long ago. Now, in 1945, everything had changed. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself, starved of fuel, stripped of experienced pilots, fighting against an enemy that could outproduce, outfly, and outlast them in every conceivable way. And yet, even as their world collapsed, even as Germany burned, they had clung to one belief, that the Americans could bomb Berlin, yes, but they would never dare to escort their bombers all the way. That, they thought, was impossible. Until this morning. The Mustangs came like phantoms, silver and fearless, their Merlin engines singing a sound the Germans had learned to dread. Every pilot in the Luftwaffe knew that sound, the high, smooth whine of a P-51 diving from above, machine guns already spitting death. The B-17 and B-24 bombers had always been terrifying in their own right, but it was the arrival of the Mustangs that broke morale. They didn't just protect the bombers, they hunted. They stayed after the bombers turned home, prowling the skies, for any stragglers, any German plane foolish enough to take off. They were predators with endless range. From his cockpit, Dieter saw something else, something that chilled him even more. These weren't just Mustangs, these were seasoned killers. The pilots flying them didn't jerk their sticks or waste their ammo in bursts of panic. They moved with precision, with the kind of cold efficiency that only comes from surviving dozens of dogfights. He watched one Mustang bank left, dip under a cloud, and reappear behind a German flak battery like a ghost. Its tracers lit up the morning. The flak gun erupted in flame. One pass, one kill, no hesitation. Below, Berlin's air defenses tried to respond. Searchlights cut across the sky. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, thundering with desperate fury. But the Mustangs were too fast, too agile. They didn't dive into the fire. They danced through it. Every movement looked choreographed, like ballet painted in smoke and fire. And as the tracers arced through the air, the truth became undeniable. The Americans were no longer guests in Germany's sky. They were its new landlords. At Luftwaffe command, the radios crackled with disbelief. "Confirm identification. Are they Mustangs?" one officer barked. The response came back sharp, panicked. "Ya, sir! P-51 Mustangs! Hundreds of them!" Silence. Then a grim voice said, "Then the war is over." The realization spread through Berlin like a shock wave, not just among the soldiers but civilians too. People stepped out of air raid shelters, blinking at the sun, and saw contrails cutting white scars across the blue. Some thought they were their own, German fighters protecting the city. But the longer they stared, the more they realized the truth. The formation was too tight, too disciplined, too fearless to be Luftwaffe. These planes weren't circling defensively. They were patrolling. They owned the sky. For the first time since the war began, Berliners looked up and saw American aircraft flying freely overhead, not bombers dropping destruction, but sleek fighters flying as if they had come to stay. In the air, the psychological effect was immediate and devastating. For Luftwaffe pilots, the sky had always been their last refuge, the one place where they could still feel superior. Even as cities burned and armies retreated, they could climb above the clouds and feel like gods again. But now, even that illusion was shattered. The P-51 Mustang had stolen it from them. The Mustang wasn't supposed to be possible. Back in 1942, German intelligence had laughed at early Allied fighter designs, calling them short-range toys. The idea that an escort fighter could follow bombers all the way to Berlin and back was fantasy, a logistical impossibility. Yet here it was, slicing through their airspace on the power of its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an engine born from British ingenuity, refined by American industry. It could climb to 40,000 feet, cruise at over 430 miles per hour, and, most importantly, fly for nearly 1,600 miles without refueling. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a long-range executioner. Hans Dieter tried to rally his wing. "Form up! We'll attack from above!" he shouted into his radio, but only static answered. Half his comrades were already scattering. One by one, their planes dropped out of the clouds, engines screaming, smoke trailing. The Mustangs were picking them off before they could even reach formation altitude. He caught a glimpse of one, its pilot wearing a bright yellow scarf that flapped in the slipstream, as it looped gracefully around a burst of flak and dove straight toward him. Dieter pulled hard on his stick, feeling his stomach lurch as the G-forces slammed him back. The Mustang flashed past, so close he could see the White Star insignia painted on its wing. He rolled his Messerschmitt into a dive, the engine screaming in protest. He had been trained to fight the Spitfire. Agile, elegant, predictable. But this thing moved differently. It climbed faster, held energy longer, and struck like lightning. There was no rhythm to exploit, no weakness to bait. The Mustang didn't dogfight in the old sense. It hunted. Below them, the city burned. Allied bombers had already flattened most of Berlin's industrial zones, but the Americans weren't content with that. They were destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to resist, hangars, runways, fuel depots, radar posts. Anything that could let a German plane take off was now a target. And the Mustangs made sure nothing escaped. From the ground, German civilians stared in awe. The Mustangs looked almost beautiful, silver wings glinting in the sunlight as they weaved through the smoke. But to the soldiers manning flak towers, that beauty was terrifying. They fired until their barrels glowed red, but the fighters moved like they could read their minds. Whenever one gun opened up, a Mustang swooped in, strafed it, and pulled up before the smoke even cleared. Hours later, when the last Mustang finally turned west, Berlin's skies were quiet, eerily quiet. The Luftwaffe had managed to get only a handful of planes airborne, and most of those were gone. The Americans had lost none. It was more than just a tactical defeat. It was the death of German air superiority itself. The myth of invincible Luftwaffe dominance evaporated that morning over the Reich's capital. In a hidden bunker, General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's legendary ace, reviewed the combat reports. His hands trembled as he read the same phrase over and over again, engaged by P-51 at high altitude. Enemy superior in speed and climb. The words felt like a confession. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and muttered, They're over Berlin now. It's finished. But for the Mustang pilots, the day wasn't one of triumph. It was a mission that felt almost unreal. They had flown farther, fought harder, and returned home knowing that they had seen the end written in the clouds. Their commanders didn't give long speeches. They simply pointed to the map, drew a line from England to Berlin, and said, "Nowhere is safe anymore." And that line, that thin red arc across the map, was the line that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. They said the sky over Europe had its own smell: oil, gunpowder, and the faint sweetness of burning aluminum. And for the men of the Luftwaffe, that scent had once been victory. But by 1944, it smelled like fear. Every morning, as the alarms wailed across airfields from Bremen to Brandenburg, German pilots climbed into their cockpits knowing the odds were stacked. The fuel was scarce, and the enemy's reach was endless. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Berlin was supposed to be untouchable, the heart of the Reich, shielded by hundreds of miles of territory and the finest fighter force ever assembled. Yet now, as dawn light crept over the horizon, the radio chatter filled with disbelief. "Mustangs! Over Berlin!" The words spread faster than the sound of engines. Mechanics dropped wrenches. Officers ran from their barracks. Everyone looked up and saw them. Sleek, silver fighters slicing through the morning haze, contrails shimmering like threads of steel. It wasn't just a raid. It was a message. The Americans had crossed the line that Germany believed impossible. They had brought the war to the Luftwaffe's front yard. For Captain Heinrich Adler, who had flown since 1940, this was more than a battle. It was an ending. He had once felt invincible in his Bf-109, diving on Spitfires over France, counting kills like trophies. But the war had aged him faster than he could understand. His friends were gone, replaced by boys barely trained. His aircraft were patched together with parts from wrecks. And now the sky itself, his sanctuary, belonged to someone else. When he first spotted the Mustangs, they looked too perfect to be real. The sunlight gleamed on their polished fuselages, their wings flexed with power. He banked hard to intercept, heart pounding, but before he could close the distance, tracers streaked past his canopy, bright red lines cutting through his thoughts. The Americans weren't defending anymore. They were attacking. Adler pulled into a climb, the G-force crushing his chest, his engine howling in protest. But the Mustang followed. It stayed on him like a predator that had studied every move of its prey. Inside that American cockpit, Lieutenant Jack Morrison barely blinked. His hands were steady, his breathing calm. He had trained for this moment, to hunt the hunters. His Mustang's Merlin engine roared like a storm, propeller biting into the cold air. He squeezed the trigger, and 8 50-caliber machine guns thundered in unison. The recoil shook the whole plane, and for a split second, the air filled with glowing lead. The German fighter shuddered, smoke pouring from its nose, then spiraled downward in slow motion, its once graceful form tumbling toward the city below. Jack didn't cheer. He didn't even speak. There was no joy in it, just a grim awareness that the tables had turned for good. Down below, the factories that once built Germany's aircraft were now blackened skeletons. The Reich had bet everything on technology, on speed, on the genius of a few. But America had bet on something else: scale. The Mustang was the embodiment of that idea, built by thousands of hands, fueled by endless supplies, supported by an industrial machine that could replace losses overnight. For every plane the Luftwaffe lost, it took months to rebuild. For every Mustang shot down, another rolled off an assembly line within hours. The imbalance was so absolute that even Luftwaffe intelligence reports read like obituaries. By afternoon, the dogfights spread from the skies over Berlin to the northern countryside. Villagers looked up from their fields and saw formations twisting in deadly spirals, silver and gray streaks merging, breaking, and vanishing into clouds. To them, it looked like chaos, but inside those cockpits, it was math and instinct. The Mustang pilots fought with surgical precision. They used altitude, energy retention, teamwork, things that German pilots had once mastered but could no longer afford to teach properly. Every veteran Luftwaffe ace had become an instructor out of necessity, and every instructor was running out of students to train. As dusk fell, Adler limped back toward his airfield. His fuel gauge was near empty, his radio silent. He had survived, but the silence told him everything. The Mustangs had cleared the sky. He saw burning wrecks on the horizon, aircraft that never made it home. One by one, the airfields that had been Germany's pride were reduced to smoking craters. Mechanics ran through debris shouting names, but there were fewer voices left to answer. That night, in a small underground command post, officers gathered around a map. Pins marked every known Allied approach route. A red line stretched straight to Berlin, unbroken. General Galland leaned over the table and said quietly, "They've taken the air." No one replied. No one needed to. Outside, the faint echo of engines still lingered, Mustangs returning to England. Their pilots sipping coffee, writing mission reports, unaware that they had just ended an empire's dream of control. For the men on the ground, it was the first night in years they could look up and know they didn't own the darkness. Even the stars seemed foreign now, glinting above the trails of smoke that once marked the path of German fighters. And as the city below flickered under blackout, the truth settled like ash. The Luftwaffe wasn't defeated in a single battle. It was erased, piece by a machine that didn't tire, didn't falter, and didn't stop until the last German wing was grounded. When morning came again, the contrails were back, white scars across a gray sky. And for every German who saw them, it felt like the writing of a new world, one where even the air belonged to someone else. By the third week of relentless daylight raids, the once proud Luftwaffe had begun to resemble a ghost of its former self, a force fighting not for victory, but for survival, clawing for control over skies it no longer owned. In hangars that still stood amid the ruins, mechanics worked by lantern light, their hands trembling as they tightened bolts on engines scavenged from wrecks. The ground trembled with distant booms from American bombers unloading their fury miles away, and the men knew it was only a matter of time before their turn came. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. And the weapon that sealed their fate wasn't a secret bomb or a wonder jet. It was a silver-winged predator that appeared out of nowhere, silent until it roared, deadly until it vanished. The P-51 Mustang. It wasn't just a plane. It was a message written in speed and fire. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine howling like a vengeful spirit, it could climb higher, dive faster, and fight longer than anything Germany could field. The Luftwaffe's pilots called it der lange Arm der Bomber, the long arm of the bombers, because no matter how far they retreated, the Mustangs followed. Before its arrival, German fighters had relied on hit-and-run tactics, ambushing bomber formations, then retreating before escorts arrived. But now there was no escape window. The Mustangs were there from the first mile to the last, prowling above and below the bombers like silent guardians. To young Oberfeldwebel Karl Metzger, it was a nightmare with wings. He had just turned 20 and was barely out of flight school when his squadron was ordered to intercept an incoming formation north of Berlin. The morning sky was deceptively calm, streaked with pink and gold, the kind of dawn poets once wrote about. But Karl knew better. The moment he reached 15,000 feet, the radio crackled with panic. Achtung! Mustangs, 2 o'clock high! The formation broke instantly. In seconds, the sky transformed from serenity to chaos. Karl saw them, dark specks growing larger, faster, until the sun caught their wings, revealing that silver shine that had become every German pilot's dread. He tried to climb, but the Mustang's speed closed the gap like lightning. Tracers erupted around him, red dots turning into blazing lines. He rolled hard right, feeling his stomach twist, the horizon flipping over and over. His engine screamed, oil pressure dropped, and smoke filled his cockpit. He didn't remember bailing out. Just the sudden rush of cold air and the realization that he was falling through a world of fire. Below him, Berlin stretched like a wounded animal, columns of smoke rising where factories once hummed, railway lines shattered, power grids flickering. The civilians who once cheered parades now cowered in basements as sirens wailed. The war that Germany had unleashed on the world had finally turned around and come home, riding on the wings of the Mustang. Allied pilots, many just as young as Carl, had grown ruthless through repetition, fighting not out of hate, but out of grim necessity. Each mission was mechanical. Escort the bombers, clear the skies, ensure no German fighters got close enough to threaten the swarm. But beneath that discipline burned something else. Vengeance for years of blood spilled over Europe, for the cities bombed and friends buried. The P-51 was not just a tool. It was justice with a throttle. By noon, the Luftwaffe's last reserves scrambled. They came from every corner. FW-190s, Me-109s, even a few Me-262 jets trying to break through the chaos. But coordination was gone. Radar stations had been bombed, fuel reserves were dwindling, and new pilots barely knew how to fly, let alone fight. The Mustangs exploited every weakness. They dived from the sun, attacked in pairs, and vanished before the Germans could react. What made it worse was their endurance. The P-51 could fly from England to Berlin, fight, and return home with fuel to spare. No German fighter could dream of that. The Luftwaffe was chained to its homeland, while the Americans ruled the skies from horizon to horizon. That evening, when the bombing ceased, the silence was unbearable. The smoke rose higher than the church steeples, and what little light filtered through was red, as if the sun itself mourned the fall of the Reich's air power. At a shattered airfield outside Potsdam, a few surviving pilots gathered around a burning oil drum. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The looks on their faces said everything: exhaustion, disbelief, and a deep, hollow fear that tomorrow would be worse. Somewhere in the darkness, the faint hum of engines echoed. They froze, staring into the night, and then it appeared again, that distinctive growl of a Merlin engine high above. The Mustangs were still there, circling like ghosts, reminding everyone below that there was nowhere left to hide. Back in England, in a damp briefing tent, the pilots who had flown that mission wrote their after-action reports. They listed their kills, fuel usage, and ammunition counts in neat handwriting. But between the lines was something unspoken: awe at what they had seen. The Mustang had done what no one believed possible. It had brought air supremacy to the heart of enemy territory. One pilot scribbled in the margin, "Berlin looks smaller from up there." Another wrote simply, "They didn't even fight back." For the Allied commanders, that was proof that the tide had turned irrevocably. For the Luftwaffe, it was the moment they realized the sky, once their throne, had become their grave. And yet, the Americans knew this was only the beginning. Because every flight over Berlin was more than a mission. It was a test of endurance, of nerve, of faith that the next day they could do it all again. Behind each Mustang was an army of thousands: the builders, the engineers, the women who riveted metal and packed ammunition in dim factories across the ocean. The men flying above the Reich were not alone. They carried the weight of an entire nation's will to finish what had begun on December 7th, 1941. As night fell over Europe, the contrails of that day's battle slowly faded, dissolving into the black sky. But for those who had seen them, German and American alike, they would never fade from memory. They marked a moment in history when one machine, born of necessity and perfected through blood, changed the balance of war forever. And while Berlin still burned, its defenders looked to the heavens, waiting for a dawn that would never again belong to them. By the time dawn cracked the frozen horizon over Germany, the Luftwaffe's last gamble was already underway, a desperate, almost suicidal attempt to reclaim control of the skies above Berlin. The airfields around Rechlin, Brandenburg, and Magdeburg buzzed with activity, though the word buzz barely captured the atmosphere. It was chaos held together by fear. Mechanics sprinted across tarmac littered with shell casings, refueling trucks belched smoke, and young pilots, barely out of flight school, climbed into machines that looked more like relics than instruments of war. The order was clear: intercept the incoming bombers at all costs. But every man there knew what those words really meant: a one-way mission. They had heard the rumors, the stories whispered in bunkers and barracks alike, that the Americans had a new escort fighter that didn't turn back. The P-51 Mustang had become a legend before most Germans had even seen it. And that morning they would see it in full. Terrible reality. The plan, hastily drawn and even more hastily approved, was to use every available aircraft to attack from multiple altitudes. The Luftwaffe's once mighty organizational structure had crumbled under relentless bombing. Radar coverage was spotty, fuel was rationed, and command communications were so fragile that entire squadrons sometimes took off without orders. But desperation breeds creativity and madness. Oberst Hans Röll, a veteran ace with more than 80 kills, led the strike. He had seen the Reich's air power rise and now watched it crumble, and deep down he knew this would be his final stand. Before takeoff, he gathered his pilots and told them something they would never forget. If we fall today, let them remember we fought above our capital, not behind it. It wasn't strategy, it was defiance. As the first formations of American bombers appeared on the horizon, the Germans climbed into position, engines howling, condensation trails cutting sharp scars across the pale sky. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the old days, the proud Luftwaffe sweeping in for the kill. But that illusion shattered the instant the escorts appeared. They didn't come from ahead or behind. They came from above, from out of the sun, a blinding silver flash that turned into a deadly swarm. The P-51 Mustangs dived in perfect coordination, their Merlin engines screaming like banshees. One pilot later said, "It was like being attacked by the sky itself." The Germans tried to break formation, diving and rolling to shake off the attackers, but the Mustangs were relentless, with drop tanks now allowing them to cross the continent. Their range was unmatched, and their pilots, confident, skilled, battle-hardened, fought like men who had already seen the end of the war and were determined to finish it. They darted between bomber formations, firing short, surgical bursts that tore through enemy aircraft with frightening precision. In minutes, the air battle above Berlin became a storm of fire and smoke. Fairbabu-190 spun out of control, Me-109s exploded mid-turn, and every dive, every scream of metal seemed to echo Germany's collapsing hopes. Oberst Röll locked onto one Mustang and squeezed the trigger, his cannons roaring. But it was like trying to hit lightning. The American rolled, climbed, and vanished behind a cloud bank, only to reappear seconds later on Röll's tail. The German ace tried one last evasive maneuver, a corkscrew dive, but his right wing was shredded by .50 caliber fire. The cockpit filled with smoke. Alarms wailed, and his plane became a burning comet falling toward the forests below. As he bailed out, he glimpsed something that would haunt him forever. Hundreds of contrails, white scars in the sky, stretching in perfect lines over Berlin. It wasn't just air power. It was industrial might, discipline, and destiny woven together in motion. Down below, Berliners poured into the streets, staring upward at the spectacle. Housewives, soldiers on leave, even children clutching ration tins, all watched as the skies over their capital turned into a living inferno. Some cheered their own pilots as they took off. Others fell silent, realizing the imbalance was too great. For every German fighter that rose, 3 Mustangs descended. When wreckage began to rain from the clouds, those cheers turned to gasps. The myth of invincibility that had carried the Reich for years was burning away, piece by piece, right before their eyes. At Allied headquarters, the radio chatter told a story that would later become legend. "Eagle 1, this is Thunder Lead. We have air superiority." "Repeat, air superiority confirmed over Berlin." The words sent a ripple through the command tent. Generals looked at each other in disbelief, not because they doubted the report, but because they understood what it meant. The heart of Nazi Germany, the seat of its power, the capital of its empire, was no longer under its own control. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could no longer defend its own skies, but victory came with a price. Mustang pilots returned with bullet holes in their wings, oil leaking from engines, faces streaked with sweat and exhaustion. They had seen friends go down, parachutes drifting like broken feathers into enemy territory. Yet despite the losses, morale soared. The P-51 wasn't just a plane, it was proof that strategy, technology, and unyielding will could conquer even the fiercest opponent. And perhaps most shockingly, it was designed not by a giant defense contractor, but by a company that built civilian aircraft just months before the war began. That fact alone struck fear into German engineers. If the Americans could turn such simplicity into dominance, what else were they capable of? The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was devastating. Surviving pilots returned to bases that no longer had fuel, replacements, or hope. They sat in silence, chain-smoking, staring at the floor while officers tried to rally them with promises of new jet fighters and secret weapons. But deep down they knew it was over. The P-51 had done more than win air battles. It had broken the spirit of the Luftwaffe. The idea that any pilot could climb into a cockpit and expect to come home alive was fading fast. Every mission felt like marching into a storm with no return. That night, Allied crews toasted their success. The bar at the English airfield echoed with laughter, music, and stories, some exaggerated, others too painful to tell. But amidst the celebration, a quiet understanding lingered. They had achieved something monumental, air superiority over Berlin, but they also knew it marked a turning point that would only grow darker. Because now, with the skies secured, the bombers could strike at will. The city that had once symbolized the might of the Reich would soon feel the full weight of retribution, and yet, among the German survivors, something even more haunting began to spread. A grim admiration. They spoke of the Mustangs not with hatred, but with respect. "Sie sind wie Wölfe," one pilot said. "They are like wolves." The comparison was perfect. The P-51s hunted in packs, struck with precision, and disappeared before you could react. For those who lived through it, the memory of that silver flash cutting through the clouds would never fade. It was the sound of inevitability, the final, mechanical heartbeat of a dying empire. When the last Mustang disappeared beyond the clouds that evening, the sky over Berlin fell silent for the first time in hours. But to those watching from the ground, the silence was worse than the battle. Because silence meant defeat. Silence meant the Americans would return tomorrow and the day after, until there was nothing left to fight for. The war was dying, and the sky above Europe had become its final witness. Vast, pale and heavy with the ghosts of burned engines and lost names. By the spring of 1945, every Luftwaffe pilot who climbed into a cockpit knew that the sky no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to the Mustangs. They came in endless waves, silver reflections of an empire that had learned how to fight not just with men, but with machines that never seemed to tire, never seemed to stop. The P-51s didn't patrol. They dominated. From the moment their engines began to hum on English airstrips, every German radar operator, every flak crew, every trembling pilot knew what it meant. Somewhere, far above the clouds, the hunters were coming. And on those last days, when Berlin was a smoking wound on the horizon, even the most seasoned German aces admitted something they would have never believed 2 years earlier. The Americans had mastered the sky. For men like Oberleutnant Dieter König, a survivor of the Eastern Front now stationed at Tempelhof, it was a nightmare that no training could prepare him for. He remembered the first time he saw a Mustang, a glint in the distance, mistaken for sunlight until the tracers started screaming. His squadron never stood a chance. The P-51s could turn tighter, climb faster, dive steeper, and when they opened fire, it was like the air itself tore apart. Koenig described it later as fighting shadows with bullets. That final month, his mission briefings didn't include strategy anymore, just survival. Pilots joked grimly that if they made it past 10 minutes, they'd buy the next round of schnapps. Most didn't. The few who did land came back with eyes hollowed by exhaustion and the shaking hands of men who had looked death in the face and realized it had an American accent. The Americans, meanwhile, were writing history with contrails. Each white streak over Germany marked another victory in a battle no one had thought winnable. Just 3 years earlier, the idea of daylight bombing Berlin had seemed suicidal, a fantasy whispered in Allied command tents. But now, those same bombers flew in formations so vast that German spotters called them floating cities. And around those bombers, like guardian angels made of steel, the P-51s wove their pattern, climbing, Looping, diving, firing, the choreography of dominance. Pilots like James Goodson, Don Gentile, and George Preddy became legends not because of kill counts, but because they embodied something larger, a shift in power so complete that it changed the meaning of air warfare itself. The Luftwaffe's radio frequencies told the story before history did. Static, broken cries, coordinates shouted and then cut short by gunfire. Achtung! Mustangs über uns! Came the calls again and again until the words lost meaning. They were background noise, part of the atmosphere of defeat. Even the once invincible Messerschmitt Me-262 jets couldn't save them. They were fast, yes, but too few, too late and too fragile. The Mustang pilots learned to strike them as they took off or landed, exploiting every weakness with ruthless precision. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a technological exorcism. From the ground, civilians stared upward at a sky stitched with white and gray trails. To some, it looked beautiful, almost serene, until the sound reached them. The thunder of engines, the crack of guns, the distant whine of falling wreckage. Mothers pulled their children inside as pieces of burning metal rained down on ruined streets. The sky itself seemed to weep fire. And yet, among the chaos, an undeniable realization began to spread. The Reich's time was over. For the first time since 1939, people in Germany could look up and see hope. Not their own, but the world's. At Allied air bases, the return of the Mustangs became a ritual. Crews waited with binoculars, counting the dots emerging from the haze, cheering each one that made it back. Some planes returned riddled with holes, their fuselages leaking oil, wings shredded, but their pilots grinning through the grime. Because every return meant another mission completed, another step closer to ending the nightmare. They had turned the tide not with overwhelming numbers alone, but with endurance, innovation, and a belief that air power could end tyranny faster than any army could march. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter. It was the symbol of a nation that refused to surrender the skies. For the Luftwaffe, however, the war didn't end with a single defeat. It ended slowly, painfully, in hangars filled with broken planes and pilots too numb to speak. They would watch Allied formations pass overhead, unchallenged, the rumble fading like a funeral march. Some officers ordered what few aircraft remained to be burned, denying them to the enemy. Others simply walked away, leaving behind flight logs and photographs, silent tombstones of a lost brotherhood. In diaries found after the war, German pilots confessed admiration for their opponents. "The Mustang is the perfect predator," one wrote. "It kills without mercy, but with beauty." When Berlin finally fell, the Mustangs flew victory circles above the city, their reflections flickering in the shattered windows below. The war's last sound in the air wasn't gunfire. It was the low, steady purr of their engines, a mechanical lullaby over ruins that had once roared with ambition. The Luftwaffe was gone, its proud eagle broken. But in that silence, a strange respect lingered, a recognition that in the sky, unlike on the ground, men had fought as equals. Years later, when surviving pilots met at reunions, American and German alike, they spoke of that time not with hatred, but with awe. They remembered the feel of frost on canopies at 30,000 feet, the flash of sunlight on enemy wings, the terrifying beauty of combat in the clouds. And every conversation ended the same way. Someone would say, softly, "Do you remember the first time you saw a Mustang?" And the room would fall silent, because everyone remembered. Every man who fought in that sky, on either side, carried that memory like a scar. Today, when a restored P-51 roars to life at an air show, its propeller carving through the air with that same deep-throated growl, veterans still look up, some smiling, some wiping away quiet tears. To the crowds below, it's just a plane. To them, it's everything: youth, courage, loss, victory. The embodiment of a moment when history tilted in midair and the future of the free world was decided not on the ground, but among the clouds. And if you stand on a clear day and listen long enough, you might still hear it, the faint echo of Merlin engines over Berlin, the sound of defiance giving way to destiny, and the whisper of a sky once filled with fire, now at peace.